So this Shabbat we conclude our study of Parashat Vayeshev, which covers the portions of the Torah contained in Genesis 37 verse 1 through chapter 40 verse 23. In this portion we find so many clear and illuminating pictures of Messiah Yeshua. And as we've so often pointed out, this is the Torah portion that begins our study of Joseph. And we see in Joseph many of the foreshadowings of this Messianic figure, the Messiah, Ben Yosef, the son of Joseph, the suffering servant that we see fulfilled in Messiah Yeshua. And I think that's what makes this Torah portion and the one that follows it so special. We good? Okay, that's all right. Now, Rabbi Todd told me I only have 2 hours tonight, so we're going to hit the high points. And now, but I trust as I share some of the thoughts with you tonight, your faith and testimony will be strengthened as we consider the compelling evidence presented through this many examples in this Torah portion portraying Yeshua as the Messiah spoken about by Moses. Like Messiah said himself, "For if you were believing Moses, you would be believing me because he wrote about me." Amen. I'm trying to see if I need to stall here. The PowerPoint pulled up? Okay. I think we're on the third slide. Yet while the story contained herein has much to reveal regarding Messiah, the first thing we can see about him comes from simply taking note of the name of this portion and the two portions that led up to it. 2 Shabbats ago, we concluded Parashat Vayeshev, which means he went out. Last week, Parashat Vayeshlach, which means he sent. And this week, we conclude Parashat Vayeshev, which means he settled. He went out, he sent, he settled. Together, these three portions form a prophetic picture of the redemption process that is actively being fulfilled by Messiah Yeshua as we await its completion at his second coming. As we examine the good news of Messiah Yeshua, we see this redemption process. He went out, he sent, he settled, demonstrated by Yeshua's going out from his Father, his sending of his Talmidim, his disciples, and ultimately his conquering of death and his settling at the right hand of the Father. But we will see this last part of this prophetic picture fulfilled once again when he returns permanently to settle among his people, as we read in Revelation 21 verse 3. I also heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling of God is among men, and he shall tabernacle among them. They shall be his people, and God himself shall be among them and be their God." Amen. You see, when we examine the events of the Torah in continuation and in context, within this story about Adonai and his people Israel, we're able to see a big picture of God's plan of redemption for mankind. And it's no mistake that God has orchestrated the scriptures in this manner, because we are often exhorted as believers to be eagerly awaiting the promised redemption and all that it entails. We read in Romans 8, 23 to 25, "We ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Ruach, groan inwardly as we eagerly wait for adoption, the redemption of our body. For in hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, then we eagerly await it with perseverance." This is of utmost importance because in many ways our ability to endure the trials and tribulations of this world, as well as our capacity to fulfill God's purpose for us as individuals, hinges on how focused we remain on the promise of his coming and our eternal destiny with him. That's why Rob Shul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 and 18, that our trouble, light and momentary, is producing for us an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison, as we look not at what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. But waiting with anticipation doesn't mean that we sit around and do nothing, believing that Messiah is going to come back for us with open arms and welcome us into his kingdom. We are warned not to be given over to this sentiment by the Master himself in his parable regarding the servants who were entrusted with talents that they were expected to multiply for his purposes. We recall that 2 of the servants were faithful in laboring for the sake of bringing their master fortune. However, there was one who thought it was acceptable to merely present to the master what was first given and entrusted to him. And he learned a troubling lesson in Matthew chapter 25, verses 26 through 29, when we read, "But his master responded, 'You wicked, lazy servant. You knew that I reap where I didn't sow, and I gather where I scattered no seed. Then you should have brought my money to the brokers, and when I came, I would have received it back with interest. Therefore take the talent away from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to the one who has, more shall be given, and he shall have in abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away.'" And this leads us right into our next lesson that can be learned from observing the names of these three Torah portions. All three of these portions' names are active verbs, expressing the desire of Adonai that we as followers of Messiah, Yeshua, demonstrate our faith by actions and not merely words. As we read in James chapter 1, verse 22, "But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deluding yourselves." And again in Romans 2:13, where Rob Shaul tells us, "For it is not the hearers of the Torah who are righteous before God, rather it is the doers of the Torah who will be justified." And with this in mind, we must take notice of the apparent difference between the name of our portion for this week and that of the last 2 weeks. As opposed to Vayetze and Vayishlach, where the actions "he went out" and "he sent" hold the connotation of moving forward, we see in this week's portion, Vayeshev, the action holds the connotation of actively settling down. We read in the first verse of the portion, "Now Jacob checked into a retirement home." Now Jacob settled. Low is right. Now Jacob settled in a land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. Jacob decides to settle down where his father had endlessly sojourned. Here we see that perhaps Jacob had come to a point in his life where he believed that his work was done. He had finished having children. He'd lost his beloved Rachel. He reached the land of Canaan, and now he wanted to kick back, relax, and enjoy the last few years of his life. And we can't blame him, as we all sometimes feel the same way. But as tempting as this notion can so often be, we cannot let the momentary stops in life in which we reflect on the goodness of God become a perpetual ceasing from our work for the Lord. In Ephesians 5:16, Paul tells us to make the most of our time because the days are evil. He even tells us this with good reason, because when we begin to live life without full cognizance and commitment to the calling that God has for us as his disciples, the enemy, Hasatan, often takes the opportunity to lull us to sleep until we find ourselves living lives that are devoid of purpose and filled with temporal rewards that have no real value and often lead to disaster. We recall in Genesis chapter 33 when Jacob bought land and became content to settle in the land of Shechem in harmony with the idol worshippers that dwelt there. The inevitable curiosity and desire of his daughter to seek out the women of the city resulted in her tragic rape and subsequent mass murder carried out by the sons, Simeon and Levi. Upon their departure from the city, it was revealed they too had adopted the idols of the people and adorned themselves in the similar apparel. Another example of this phenomenon occurs after the Exodus from Egypt, when the Israelites believed that Moses would not be descending from Mount Sinai. They fell victim to the worship of the golden calf. We don't say that too loud. We discover that the demeanor resulting in this act of idolatry, however, was one of indulgence and perceived bliss, as we read in Exodus chapter 32, verse 6. They rose up early the next morning, sacrificed burnt offerings, and brought fellowship offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to make merry. Messiah Yeshua himself warns us that this will be the state of the world when it's at the peak of idolatry directly preceding his return. He says in Matthew 24, 37 to 39, "For just as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and swept them all away. So shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man." But to us, we're encouraged by Paul in Ephesians 5:14 to wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Messiah will shine on you. Returning to the portion, however, we see the result of Jacob's settling this time would be the unfortunate betrayal of his beloved son Joseph and his brothers, foreshadowing the suffering and subsequent exaltation of Messiah Yeshua. We catch a glimpse of this transition in status when we examine the description of Joseph in verse 2 of our portion, which says, "When Joseph was 17 years old, he was a youth. He was shepherding the flocks with his brothers, with the sons of his father's wives Bilhah and Zilpah. Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father." In this very same sentence, Joseph is oddly referred to as a Na'ar, the Hebrew word meaning youth, that's so often translated as lad or boy. But in this same sentence, it also says Chaya ro'eh et achayu, which can be literally translated as a shepherd of his brothers. Here Joseph is described in his current state as a young boy, but simultaneously in his future status as a shepherd of his family. The narrative here of a young boy with prophetic dreams of wisdom who would become a shepherd of his family corresponds perfectly with the one we follow in the good news, where Messiah Yeshua is described as a wise young child in Luke chapter 2, verse 40, which records, "The child kept growing and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him." And just 18 years later, Yeshua would reveal himself as the great shepherd in John 10, verse 11, when he says, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." In keeping with this same theme, we see the similarities between Joseph and Messiah Yeshua continue when we read verse 3, that Israel loved Joseph more than all his other sons because he was the son of his old age. So he made him a long-sleeved tunic. Here the father of Joseph loved him and exalted him by clothing him with a ketonet, the Hebrew word that is used for actually the high priest's garment in Exodus chapter 28, verse 4. And in Matthew 3, 16 and 17, we see our heavenly Father clothe his son, Messiah Yeshua, with the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, as he testifies, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." And to no surprise, like the Pharisees of Yeshua's time, Joseph's brothers become jealous of him, spurring on their anger and eventually culminating in their plot to kill him. Continuing in the portion, we witness the hatred of Joseph's brothers growing stronger as he shares the first of two dreams he would have with them. In his dream, he's binding sheaves with his brothers, and his sheaf stands upright while theirs fall before his. The meaning of the dream is conveyed as indicating that Joseph will rule over his brothers. And upon hearing about the dream, the brothers respond to Joseph indignantly, saying, "Will you truly be a king over us?" His brothers said to him, "Will you really rule over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and because of his words. In Joseph's second dream, he sees the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him. And when sharing this dream with his family, his father rebukes him for suggesting that he and his mother would also bow to him. But we read that he did not discount the dream altogether, but rather he guarded the word, according to verse 11. We recall a similar event in the life of young Yeshua, when he remained in Jerusalem after his earthly guardians had departed from the feast of Passover. After searching for him for 3 days, worriedly, they found him in the temple studying the Torah. When he offered them a somewhat obscure explanation, telling them that he was doing his father's work, though perturbed and not understanding what he meant, his mother Miriam treasured the words in her heart. Sometime after these events would come a day, however, when God's plan for Joseph's exaltation would begin. But as is often the case, in keeping with the expression, before things would be getting better for Joseph, they were going to get a lot worse. In Genesis 37, verse 12 through 13, we read, "Then his brothers went to graze their father's flock at Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, 'Aren't your brothers grazing the flocks in Shechem? Come, let me send you to them.' 'Hineni, here I am,' he said to him." We discovered that in obedience to his father, Joseph sets out to come to his brothers. But as we read on, we find that when they saw him from afar, after they conspired to kill him, demonstrating the same phenomenon experienced by Yeshua as written in John 1:11, which says, "He came to his own, but his own did not receive him." And we discover the plan to kill Joseph was secondarily a means to test the validity of his dreams, when they say in verse 20, "Come on now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these pits and say that an animal devoured him. Then let's see what becomes of his dreams." And again, in like manner, we see that there were individuals using the execution stake as a testing ground for the testimony of Yeshua. Because in Matthew 27, verse 42, we read, "He saved others," they were saying, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the stake, and we'll believe him." But concluding this chapter of the Torah portion, we approach probably the most glaring of paralleled events between the story of Joseph and the story of Yeshua. The chapter concludes with the brothers' decision to sell Joseph for 20 pieces of silver at the behest of Judah, and to strip him of his tunic as evidence that he has died. Then they send the tunic to his father, convincing him that his son has died and causing him to feel as though he had been separated from his son forever. As we read tonight in the New Covenant portion, Yeshua was also betrayed by Judah, but for 30 pieces of silver, after he was clothed in a fine tunic and mocked by the Roman soldiers. We read in Matthew 27, verse 31, "When they finished mocking him, they stripped the robe off of him and put his clothes back on, and they led him away to crucify him." And just as Jacob felt estrangement from his son, Joseph, who he believed to be dead, Yeshua expresses a sense of estrangement from his father when he exclaims, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which is translated, my God, why have you abandoned me?" But would Joseph ever be reunited with his father? You'll have to tune in next week to find out. But I'll give you a hint. If you follow what happens to Yeshua, you may be able to figure it out.
Amen.
So that's one chapter down. Do we believe Yeshua is in the Torah?
Amen.
I hope so.
Amen.
The portion takes a break now from the main narrative of Joseph and goes into this seemingly disconnected story of Judah in the portion of his life that he lived away from his primary family. And in this story we read that Judah would be married to the daughter of this mysterious character, Shua, and with her he would have 3 sons. The oldest of his sons would suffer death by the hand of God because he was evil. And as a result, his wife Tamar would be given to his younger brother in order to produce offspring for him. However, we see that his brother would sabotage every attempt to reproduce offspring. And as a result, God took his life as well. Out of fear of losing his last and final son, Judah tells Tamar to return to her father's house until his youngest son grows up, and then to be married to him. But Judah was unfaithful to her in withholding his son once he was grown. And the climax of the story occurs when Tamar successfully disguises herself as a prostitute in order to consort with Judah and bear children by him, the descendants of whom would be King David and the Messiah according to the flesh. And the story concludes with Tamar revealing to Judah what he had done unknowingly, and then Judah's public confession that he had been unfaithful to her by withholding his son. This is an interesting story because it often raises so many challenging questions that we have regarding the morality of Tamar and her plan. But from every angle that we look at this story, it's evident that Adonai had providentially intervened along the way.
Amen.
And the story holds great messianic significance because we know that Messiah must come from the line of Judah, and this story reveals the son through whom Messiah would come. But when we take a closer look at the story, we see a deeper lesson here that, when acknowledged, reveals its connectivity to the greater narrative of Joseph. Up to this point, it seems as though Judah has not been able to clearly see the effect that his actions have on those around him. And if he has, He hasn't exhibited any remorse for his actions. After all, it was his idea to sell Joseph, and he was content to allow Tamar to remain a widow. But like the great father that he is, Adonai disciplines Judah in a way that would bring him to a true recognition of his sin, resulting in a genuine confession of it at the end of the story. At the end of this account, when Tamar would present the 3 items Judah gave to her for a pledge of payment for their encounter, the Lord would have her use some very important words in doing so. In Genesis chapter 38, verse 21, she says to him, "I'm pregnant by the man to whom these things belong." Then she said, "Do you recognize whose these are, the seal, the cords, and the staff?" By asking Judah to identify the items, he would be condemned in the same manner that he and his brothers wronged their father when they asked him to identify Joseph's tunic in order to deceive him into believing his son was dead. We see this method of discipline employed against Abraham when he makes the mistake of procreating with the Egyptian handmaid Hagar at the request of his wife Sarah. Later on, when she suggests that he should send his beloved son Ishmael away, God tells him to heed her voice as he had done at the first. These examples serve as a reminder to us that the circumstances of our life often function as mirrors, showing us our own iniquities. And through discernment and reflection, we should seek to make teshuvah and turn back to God while little discipline is necessary. However, when we choose not to practice this discernment, we're reminded that just as Judah was condemned by his words, we too will be held accountable for ours. Messiah warns us this in Matthew chapter 12, verse 36 and 37, when he says, "But I tell you that on the day of judgment, men will give account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." Amen. In the last leg of the portion, Joseph begins to thrive in his position of a servant for a prominent Egyptian who trusts him with everything that he has. God gives great favor to Joseph, and all is well until the wife of his master determines to entice him to lay with him. Joseph remains faithful, however, and ends up falsely being accused of making advances on her one day when he comes to work and she is alone, left in the house. The situation results in him being imprisoned, where once again God helps him to gain the trust of the prison ward and leadership over all the inmates. The portion concludes with Joseph's interpreting the dreams of 2 prisoners who share the details of their slumbers with him. And Joseph asks the prisoner to whom he gave a positive interpretation to remember him when he is restored to his former position as a cupbearer of Pharaoh. Yet when the interpretation is fulfilled, the cupbearer forgets Joseph, and he remains imprisoned for the time being. I hope the overwhelming pictures that are presented here throughout this portion will resonate in our souls as we're strengthened in our faith and as we reflect on these just endless parallels, which twice as much time wouldn't suffice to go through this entire story and even the portion to come. I just pray that that will equip us to be better professors of the good news of Messiah Yeshua.